One word, that's all it took to turn a routine flight into a courtroom of whispers. The engine still roared, but inside the cabin, silence spread like wildfire as heads turned, eyes widened, and phones angled discreetly. When a child clung to the man in first class and called him Daddy, it wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was a revelation too uncanny to ignore. And from that moment on, no one on board saw him the same way again. Stay with us, because what begins as an innocent word becomes a truth too heavy to ignore. The cabin hummed with the low drone of engines, a steady vibration that carried through the seats and into the bones of every passenger. The first-class cabin of Flight 307 gleamed with muted gold light and the soft hush of privilege. Champagne poured into crystal flutes, blankets of cashmere folded across polished leather seats, and conversations spoken just above a whisper, as though volume itself was an intrusion. In seat 4A, Ethan Cole sat with the practiced ease of someone used to being catered to. His navy suit was tailored to perfection, his silver-threaded hair combed back with precision. He looked every inch the man who had built empires from numbers and risk, whose eyes carried the distance of someone who had won more than he'd ever lost. And yet, behind that poise, loneliness lived like a shadow. Across the aisle, the world was different. Beyond the thin partition, economy pressed close with restless bodies, cramped knees, and voices that rose and fell like a tide. There, Naomi Daniels struggled in her narrow seat, her curls pulled back in a hasty bun, her brown skin glistening with a sheen of fatigue. Her son Micah squirmed on her lap, his small hands tugging at her sleeve, his wide eyes darting to the window and then to the seatback tray, as though everything around him demanded his attention at once. His questions tumbled out faster than she could hush them, his energy as boundless as the sky they flew through. The plane jolted, a sharp pocket of turbulence rippling through the cabin. Gasps rose, cups rattled, and Naomi clutched Micah tighter, murmuring reassurances even as her own heartbeat raced. He whimpered, wriggling against her hold, his small frame restless with fear. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, steadying herself against the seats. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Naomi nodded quickly, though her trembling hands betrayed her. Micah wriggled harder, nearly knocking the cup of juice from her tray. "Would you like me to hold him for a moment?" the attendant asked gently, her eyes flicking toward first class. Before Naomi could protest, the offer became action. The attendant turned toward seat 4A, her polite smile fixed on Ethan Cole. "Sir, would you mind?" Ethan looked up, startled, the Wall Street detachment in his eyes faltering as Micah's gaze found his. Without warning, the boy leaned forward, his arms reaching instinctively. Naomi hesitated, her lips parting in uncertainty, but turbulence jolted again, forcing her hand. She let go just long enough for Ethan to gather Micah into his arms. The child pressed against his chest, small fingers gripping the silk of his tie. Ethan froze, the scent of crayons and apple juice replacing the sterile aroma of his cologne. Micah looked up at him, eyes wide, and whispered one word soft enough to pierce through the hum of the engines, a word that turned heads before Ethan himself could breathe. "Daddy." The word lingered in the air, heavier than the roar of the engines. "Daddy." It slipped from Micah's lips with the innocence of a child who had no idea he'd just cracked open a man's carefully ordered world. Ethan stiffened, his chest rising in a sharp breath, his mind scrambling for reason. He had never been good with children, never allowed them near enough to unsettle him. Yet here he was, with a small boy curled against him, his heartbeat echoing through Ethan's pressed shirt, like a question demanding an answer. Around them, the cabin reacted in waves. A woman in pearls leaned forward with a knowing smile, whispering something to her husband. Across the aisle, a man raised his brows in judgment, as though Ethan had been caught in some secret scandal. A teenager lifted her phone, angling it just enough to capture the tableau. The air shifted from routine travel to hushed theater. Every pair of eyes locked on the hedge fund titan and the child who had just claimed him. Naomi's face flushed crimson as she reached for Micah. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her voice tight with embarrassment. He doesn't know what he's saying." She tugged gently at her son's arm, but Micah clung harder, his tiny fingers twisted in Ethan's silk tie as though he had found a lifeline. Ethan looked down, really looked. The boy's curls framed his face in a halo of untamed softness. His lashes, impossibly long, fluttered against skin the color of warm bronze. And then there was the chin, the sharp curve he had seen every morning in the mirror since his 20s. The resemblance struck Ethan like turbulence no pilot could steady. His throat tightened, words caught somewhere between denial and recognition. Naomi's eyes flickered with panic and something else, defiance. "Micah," she whispered, coaxing, "come back to Mommy." But Micah only nestled closer into Ethan's chest, his small voice muffled but sure. "Daddy keeps me safe." Ethan's grip shifted instinctively, no longer stiff but supportive, one arm cradling the boy as though he had always known how. He tried to speak, to correct the moment, but the words stuck in his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt unarmored, stripped of the distance money and power had built around him. And Naomi, staring at him across the aisle, knew from the look in his eyes that the past she had buried was rising, 30,000 feet above the ocean, in the arms of the man who had no idea what he had left behind. The murmurs began as soft ripples, a rustle of curiosity carried down the aisle like wind through tall grass. A woman leaned toward her husband, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, and he nodded with the solemn intrigue of someone watching a scandal bloom. A young man 2 rows back angled his phone discreetly, the faint glow of the screen betraying his intent. The flight attendants exchanged glances, professional smiles stretched thin, their unease masked but not invisible. The scene was no longer private, it was a spectacle. Naomi's hands fluttered as she tried to pry Micah from Ethan's chest, her cheeks burning under the scrutiny. "He doesn't know," she said quickly, her voice breaking against the wall of silence pressing in. "He's confused. This is nothing. Please, it's nothing." Her eyes darted to the passengers, desperate for them to believe her, to erase what had just happened with the certainty of an adult correcting a child's mistake. But Micah clung tighter, his small body trembling, his trust unshaken. Ethan heard her words, but couldn't release them. His pulse pounded with an urgency that no boardroom, no market collapse, no billion-dollar deal had ever stirred in him. He felt the boy's cheek warm against his chest, and suddenly memories he thought long buried clawed their way to the surface. Late nights in dorm rooms, laughter echoing down ivy-lined halls, Naomi's voice soft with dreams she wanted to chase. He had left those days behind without looking back, convinced ambition was worth the cost of love. But now, in the quiet chaos of a cabin suspended in the sky, he realized he had never known the full price. His gaze flicked to Naomi, searching her face for denial or explanation. She refused to meet his eyes, her jaw tight with the same defiance he remembered from the girl who never let him have the last word. That defiance was older now, sharpened by years of raising a child alone, of carrying truths she had chosen not to share. He saw it and felt a pang that startled him more than Micah's word had. The passengers' whispers swelled around them, judgment, amusement, pity, all mingling into one heavy fog. Ethan shifted slightly, his arms still around the boy who looked too much like him to dismiss. The walls he had built around his life, walls of glass towers, of power and numbers, suddenly felt fragile, cracking under the weight of a child's innocent claim. And somewhere between Naomi's silence and Micah's trust, Ethan knew the past he had walked away from had caught up with him at last. Ethan shifted in his seat, his hand hovering as if to give the child back, but Micah refused to move. His small fingers tightened around the knot of Ethan's tie, his cheek pressing more firmly against the crisp fabric of the shirt. The boy gave a low hum, a sound of comfort and belonging, the kind of trust that could not be taught or rehearsed. Ethan froze, every instinct telling him to pull away, to restore the distance that had always defined his life. Yet his body betrayed him, his arms adjusting automatically, cradling Micah with a steadiness that startled him. Naomi's chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and something raw, fear edged with fury. Her lips pressed into a thin line, as though words were poised on the tip of her tongue but restrained by pride. For years, she had carried this child alone, given him love, given him safety, given him every ounce of her strength. She had never reached for Ethan, never once asked for a handout, never once allowed herself the weakness of imagining him beside her. And now here he was, in a moment she had not invited, holding the boy who carried half his face. Ethan's thoughts unraveled in a spiral he could not stop. His empire, those towers of glass and steel, the endless meetings, the wealth measured in billions, suddenly felt small in comparison to the warm weight of the child against him. He had built a fortress of reputation, of polish and detachment, and yet not a single barrier prepared him for the ache that twisted in his chest now. His gaze traveled over Micah's features, seeing echoes of himself in the tilt of the smile, in the stubborn curve of the chin, in the restless energy radiating from every twitch of his small body. This wasn't coincidence. It was blood staring back at him. Naomi's hand reached out, trembling slightly, but she stopped short of touching her son. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but sharp. "He's mine, Ethan. Every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every question he's ever asked, I've answered. Don't think for a second that one word makes you a father." The defiance in her tone struck harder than any accusation. Ethan swallowed, unable to look away. He had walked away once, never knowing what he left behind. But 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, fate had stripped him bare. There was no running, no hiding, only a child's steady breath against his chest and the truth pressing down heavier than the sky outside. The plane shuddered as another wave of turbulence rolled through, jolting glasses and rattling trays. A few passengers gasped, clutching armrests, but in row 4, the storm was not just in the air. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but sharpened by years of authority that suddenly meant nothing. "Why didn't you tell me?" His words weren't loud, but they cut through the hum of engines, slicing into the fragile quiet Naomi was clinging to. Her head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. "You left without a word, Ethan," she hissed, her control faltering, but not breaking. "You chose your future, your money, your ambition, and I chose to survive. I gave Micah my love, my life, and I didn't need your fortune to raise him." Her voice carried just enough for the nearest passengers to hear, and a woman 2 rows back shifted uncomfortably, as though intruding on something too intimate, too raw. Micah stirred at the rising tension, his lashes fluttering as he shifted in Ethan's lap. His tiny hand reached out blindly, finding the cool metal of Ethan's watch. He gripped it tight, holding on as if to anchor the man who was unraveling beneath him. The pressure of those small fingers pulled Ethan into a silence he hadn't felt in decades, a silence that didn't come from boardrooms or deals but from a truth too heavy to ignore. He searched Naomi's face, desperate for an explanation that would ease the ache growing inside him. But her features only told the story he had never been allowed to read. Nights spent soothing a fever alone, mornings walking Micah to preschool with circles under her eyes, sacrifices he had never been asked to share. Her jaw trembled, but her gaze held firm, as if daring him to look away. Ethan opened his mouth, but the words tangled. He wanted to say he hadn't known, that he might have stayed if she had told him, that maybe everything could have been different. But the truth, lodged deep in his chest, was harsher. He hadn't looked back, not once. The absence had been his choice, whether he knew it or not. The aircraft steadied, but inside, neither of them found ground. Naomi's breath came quick and sharp, her hand brushing Micah's shoulder as though to shield him from a man who didn't deserve the title he'd been given. Ethan tightened his hold almost instinctively, his polished armor fractured by a child's touch and a woman's unyielding truth. And in that fragile space between them, 30,000 feet above the ocean, the years they had lost pressed down like gravity itself. The atmosphere in first class had shifted from hushed luxury to a charged theater where every glance, every whisper carried weight. A woman in a cream blazer leaned across the aisle, murmuring that Naomi was a saint for managing alone. Two businessmen near the bulkhead exchanged sharp looks in Ethan's direction, their eyes full of judgment, as though wealth itself had turned him into a villain before the verdict was even spoken. Phones were tilted subtly, screens aglow, capturing fragments of the unfolding drama. Privacy had evaporated. They were all actors on a stage they had never agreed to perform on. Naomi's pulse thudded in her ears as a flight attendant bent low beside Ethan, her professional smile strained. "Sir, perhaps it would be easier if I—" She gestured delicately toward Micah, her hands outstretched to relieve him. But Ethan raised one hand, palm firm, voice calm and laced with something unshakable. "He's fine where he is." The words were simple, yet they struck with the force of declaration, silencing the nearby chatter. For the first time, Naomi saw not the man who had once walked away, but a father claiming his place without hesitation. Her chest tightened, the walls she had built over 4 long years quaking under the pressure. She had sworn she needed no one, that Micah would grow up whole without the man who had left. Yet here was Ethan, holding their son as though it were the most natural thing in the world, his every instinct no longer that of a detached executive but of a protector. The recognition from the watching passengers only deepened the ache inside her. Micah shifted in Ethan's lap, his small head resting against his chest, his breath evening out in trust. The boy's hand remained curled around Ethan's watch as though tethering him to a reality he could no longer escape. Ethan glanced down, his jaw tightening, and then up toward Naomi. Their eyes locked across the narrow aisle, a storm of questions and confessions passing silently between them. Around them, the cabin hummed with unspoken verdicts. Some faces softened, seeing a family forced into collision by fate. Others hardened, quick to judge a man too late to the role he should have filled from the beginning. But in that moment, Ethan seemed immune to all of it. The weight of strangers' opinions meant nothing compared to the warmth of a boy who had claimed him with a single word. And Naomi, trembling, realized with a mixture of dread and relief that the moment she had feared most had already arrived. Ethan was no longer a stranger. Everyone could see it. He was a father. The cabin lights softened as the plane began its slow descent, casting everything in a muted glow that felt almost sacred. The chatter that had filled the air earlier ebbed into silence, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to the tension still suspended between them. Ethan sat rigid, his suit rumpled now, his tie tugged askew by Micah's small hand still tangled around it even in sleep. The boy's weight pressed into him, warm and unyielding, every breath steady against his chest. Ethan lowered his gaze, studying the curve of Micah's lashes, the gentle slope of his nose, the unmistakable tilt of his chin. A whisper escaped him before he realized it had formed. "He looks like my brother did at that age." The words hung in the dim air, fragile yet undeniable. Naomi's sharp exhale broke the quiet, a sound caught between disbelief and recognition. Her eyes flicked to Micah and then away, as if looking too long would expose the truth she had carried like a locked chest. She had seen it every day, in the way Micah smiled, in the stubborn set of his jaw. The resemblance was a ghost she had tried to bury under years of silence, but Ethan's voice had unearthed it in a heartbeat. For a moment, neither spoke. The cabin around them seemed suspended, the descent nothing more than a gentle drop through clouds. But inside Ethan, the ground had already shifted. His empire, his reputation, the life he had lived without looking back, all of it dimmed against the truth asleep in his arms. The boy wasn't theory, wasn't suspicion. He was flesh and blood, a piece of him that had lived outside his knowledge yet carried his history in every line of his face. Naomi's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles pale against the dim light. She had fought so hard to keep control of her world, to shield her son from disappointment, to raise him in strength and not in longing. Now, sitting inches from the man she had once loved and resented in equal measure, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The runway lights blinked through the window as the landing gear lowered, the final stretch before ground. But for Ethan, the real arrival wasn't measured in miles or hours. It was here, in the fragile body of a child trusting him without condition, in the silent confession etched in Naomi's eyes. The plane was landing in London, but his life was landing somewhere entirely new, into a truth he could no longer deny. The jolt of the landing reverberated through the cabin, a shudder that signaled arrival, yet Ethan's world refused to settle. The wheels touched down on London soil, but he did not move. Micah remained nestled in his arms, the child's breath warm and even, his small body heavy with the ease of complete trust. Around them, seatbelts clicked, overhead bins opened, and the shuffle of impatience filled the air. Phones lit up, cameras flashed discreetly, passengers capturing the tableau of a man, a woman, and a boy, caught in something far larger than a flight. Naomi's hands fidgeted against her knees, her spine rigid as if bracing for a final blow. She had survived 4 years without him, had stitched together her world with quiet resilience and grit, and now she sat at the threshold of a choice she had sworn never to face. Ethan turned toward her, his features stripped of the polish that usually masked him. There was no corporate armor in his eyes, only a raw honesty she hadn't seen since the nights when they had been young and reckless, when love was enough until it wasn't. "I can't change the years I lost," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding, meant only for her, though it seemed to echo through every silent corner of the cabin. "But if you'll let me, I won't lose him too." His hand tightened just slightly around Micah, as though the boy might vanish if he let go. The words held no promise of perfection, only the weight of a man finally willing to stay. Naomi's throat worked as she swallowed, her jaw tight, her heart caught between the old wound of abandonment and the fragile pull of possibility. She wanted to tell him it was too late, that she had built a life without him, that Micah needed stability, not disruption. But then she looked at her son, at the way his small hand still clung unconsciously to Ethan's tie, at the way his body fit against a chest that should have been foreign but somehow wasn't. The ache in her heart shifted into something quieter, more dangerous, hope. Micah stirred, eyelids fluttering, lips parting with the innocence of dreams spilling into waking. His voice, soft and certain, broke the fragile stalemate. "Daddy." The words settled over them like dawn breaking, not an ending, but a beginning. Naomi exhaled slowly, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a horizon that was no longer hers alone. If this story spoke to you, share it. A child's voice can echo louder than judgment, louder than silence, louder than fear. Comment below if you've ever seen truth revealed in the simplest way. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, Give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.